Thank you very much, Alphonse, for your kind words. Hello to everybody. The aim of my paper is to explore how theology that emerged in Orthodox diaspora over the course of 20th and 21st century shaped the attitude of Orthodox theology towards the West. I will analyze the emergence of Orthodox theology in diaspora in three phases: the Russian emigrant theology of the 1920s and 1930s in Paris, Greek post-colonial theology of the 1960s and 1970s in Athens, and the American Orthodox theology of the Orthodox diaspora of the 2000s and 2010s. The October Revolution in 1917 has as a consequence one of the greatest intellectual migrations in history. From 1918 to 1923, 2 million people were expelled from the country for political and ideological reasons, including a great number of the religious intelligentsia. They settled first in the Orthodox and Slavic countries and next continued toward Western metropolis, such as Berlin, Paris, London, or even New York, establishing a structure of ecclesial institution that resembled the previous Russian structure. The settlement in the West forced them to enter in dialogue with the West and to reconsider their theological views. The religious encounter with the West affected many emigrant theologians, and one of them was George Florovsky, exiled from Odessa, lived in Sofia, Prague, Paris, Belgrade, New York, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Princeton, New Jersey. For decades, the standard narrative, prompted by Florovsky's associates, Alexander Schmemann and John Meyendorff, stated that despite his ecumenical engagement, Florovsky remained in confrontation with the West in a theological sense. Florovsky's neo-patristic synthesis was considered as a liberation tool of Orthodox theology from Western captivity. This picture persisted until recently when Matthew Baker challenged these views by arguing that Florovsky's original idea about neo-patristic synthesis was a program with a constitutive ecumenical dimension. A common feature of all representatives of the Russian religious Renaissance was the aspiration to integrate art, culture, and philosophy with religion into a kind of religious synthesis. One of the main characteristics of later neo-patristic synthesis was the attempt to synthesize religion, or specifically Orthodox theology, with modern philosophical culture. However, Florovsky developed his synthesis not by following, but by challenging Vladimir Solovyov's synthesis of unity and the sophiology of Sergei Bulgakov that grew out of it. The influence of Solovyov and through him Friedrich Schelling on Florovsky led some scholars to conclude that the root of neo-patristic synthesis lies in German Romanticism. Precisely aware of this tendency of Romanticism, which incorporates religious pathos into philosophy, Florovsky criticized the Slavophile synthesis of Romanticism and ecclesiology. Florovsky's interest in Western historicism and philosophical hermeneutics, and especially the views of Dilthey, Croce, and Collingwood, demonstrates that he did not abandon philosophy. Along with the notion of synthesis, Florovsky adopted from Solovyev the ecumenical spirit of this notion. This can be seen in his commitment to a new philosophical synthesis of the patristic thought and the Western European education. The inclusion of the experience of the Catholic and Protestant West in this Orthodox synthesis created a true ecumenical synthesis. Therefore, Florovsky's engagement with the Western theological thought aimed to overarch East-West divide and the cultivation of a pro-Western and pro-ecumenical sentiment. The Greek theology developed during the 1960s and 1970s in Athens followed closely Florovsky's neo-patristic agenda, but the consequences were quite the opposite. The acute polarization of the East-West divide superseded attempts to overcome it, and the pro-Western attitudes were replaced by the anti-Western attitudes. Two of Florovsky's most prominent students, John Romanides and John Zizioulas, play an important role in this shift. The attempt to liberate the Orthodox theology from the centuries-long accumulation of Western theological concepts and methods was transformed into full-range vengeance on the West. The guilt for so-called pseudomorphosis was inflicted not on those Orthodox thinkers who uncritically adopted Western elements, but on the Western churchmen. In his polemic with Panayotis Trembelas, a representative of a Western type of Orthodox theology shaped by Protestantism and Catholicism, John Romanides attacked the Western notion of filioque, Augustine's notion of original sin, and the Anselmian notion of the atonement, and argued for the essence-energies distinction against the West. Contrary to his mentor, who considered Augustine as the greatest church father, John Zizioulas casted him as a theological villain. He attacked Augustine for introducing the principle that the oneness of God is safeguarded not by the monarchy of the Father as the principles and source of the Trinity, but by the unity of the essence. In Zizioulas' view, Augustine made multiplicity and otherness secondary to the oneness of the substance and departed from the biblical notion of God, while the Cappadocians saved this biblical notion by the identification of hypostasis with person. In order to understand this change of perspective towards the West, contemporary Orthodox scholars such as Aristotle Papanikolaou and George Demakopoulos have explained this turn in Greek theology as, quote, residual effect of Western exploitation of the colonial subject, the subaltern in all of its cultural, political, and economic manifestation, end of quote. As Sotiris Mitralexis observes, Demakopoulos and Papanikolaou's application of the post-colonial critique underwent an unusual twist. It appeared that the problem is not in the Orientalist, or in this case, Balkanist outlook, stating that the West is superior and the Orthodox is inferior, but in a critique that challenges such an outlook, which they identified with anti-Westernism. Moreover, Mitralexis argues that according to the same view, every aspect of Orthodoxy which is not fully compatible with the West, modernity and liberal democracy, is considered as fundamentalism and anti-Westernism. A similar assessment is employed on Florovsky's neo-patristic synthesis, which is deemed as a fundamentalism of tradition or as a kind of romantic Byzantinism and anti-Western polemicism. John Baer claimed that the neo-patristic synthesis was genuinely inspired by German idealism and romanticism rather than the church fathers, and as construed in opposition to the West. While Paul Gavrilyuk, in his recent book on Florovsky and the Russian religious Renaissance, overlooked 40 years of Florovsky's commitment to ecumenism and dialogue with the West. In spite of the fact that Parisian school shaped Orthodox theology in conformity with Western theological and political poles, and the Athenian school in opposition to them, the American Orthodox diaspora deemed both as anti-Western, positioning itself as the only authentic voice of Orthodox theology today. Thank you very much for your attention.